And time to check in with former White House counsel Lanny Davis. Haven't talked to you in a while, Lanny. How you been?
Good morning, Brian. Good morning, Larry. Well, I've not been I've not been good at all because what's going on at Nationals Park and my beloved Washington Nationals is quite sad. But
yeah, what an awful weekend!
Tonight.
What an awful weekend that was, wasn't it? Especially against those hated Dodgers.
Well, I used to think that the Yankees were, when I was a New York area person, my father taught me the Dodgers were Democrats, the Giants were middle of the road, and the Yankees were Republicans. So I had to decide between the Giants and the Dodgers. I rooted for the Giants. Now the Dodgers, with my oldest son, moved to Los Angeles. Still a Nats fan, but was in conflict of interest watching the Dodgers over the weekend. So this is a real difficult problem for me.
All right, so, the president on Friday surprises everybody, walks in on Jay Carney and has some things to say about the Trayvon Martin case and the Zimmerman verdict. As you listen to what the president had to say, do you think it was helpful? Or some people are saying, it had started to sort of die down. It was people were starting to move on, and now it's sort of brought this back to the forefront of discussion. Charles Groundhammer said, for example, he thought that it re-racialized the issue. What did you think about the president's comments?
I've been critical of President Obama when I disagreed, and I've supported him, especially on his policies where I've agreed. I have to say, on this one, I was worried that this is an issue that shouldn't interject race. It's about the judiciary and about the jury system, and I thought that this man would be convicted of manslaughter, and the jury thought otherwise, and I thought that we should respect that jury decision. They saw the evidence and applied the law. So I was worried that he would be questioning the jury verdict and rev up those people who are talking about civil rights violations, et cetera, which I also disagree with. So here's my big caveat for telling you that I think Barack Obama really moved me by walking the line between criticizing the verdict, which he did not, and speaking personally as a black man on what it was like growing up. And I was moved when he said that he heard cars, locks click as he walked by, or saw and felt himself followed when he was in a department store. I was moved because it reminded me of the line in To Kill a Mockingbird when Atticus Finch tells his daughter, you got to walk in other people's skin and see the world through their eyes. So here is the President of the United States being very personal, not judging others, not criticizing others, describing what it's like to be a black man, a young black man, walking through a white neighborhood. And without criticizing, and that's where he walked the fine line, he moved me, and that's just my personal reaction.
Well, I thought that parts of it were very interesting. For example, when the president talked about the black experience, because I do find that informative, seeing how I can't possibly have that experience.
Correct.
I took that. But then, the thing that bothered me about it was when he started moving into, well, we're going to look at these stand your ground laws, even though he acknowledged that, the law enforcement is generally the purview of the state. And then he talked about how I don't think it's very fruitful for politicians to get involved in discussions of race, and then he turned around and that was sort of exactly what he did.
Well, again, it was a fine line. I definitely see your point, and I'm happy to see that you're conflicted a little bit about, moved by trying to understand what the world looks like if you're a young black man in this country, and we might go over to Detroit and talk about the inner city, but at least get to the stand your ground. Very briefly, there is a lot of ambiguity in those laws. I don't like linking them to the Trayvon Martin case. That was not the issue. It was taken out of the case by Trayvon Martin's lawyers. It was not in the case. So he did, unfortunately, make a connection. I don't think he intended to put it into the case. But there is a problem in these laws. And he did say if this were Trayvon Martin shooting Mr. Zimmerman because he stood his ground, we would have a different debate in this country. There are ambiguities about when you're allowed to shoot, when you stand your ground, when you're not. They're originally designed to allow you to protect your home and not be forced to flee. It's about the obligation to flee rather than say, I was defending myself. That's what they're about. But there's a lot of ambiguity, and it's worth discussing. I think associating that with the trial was the unfortunate part of what he did.
But with all due respect, Lanny, I mean, I bring your attention to the story of Roderick Scott. Now, you might not know this story because, well, it didn't make a lot of news. It made a lot of news right in the area where it appeared, which was Rochester, Illinois. But in Rochester, Roderick Scott, a black neighborhood watchman, he shot and killed Christopher Cervini, a 17-year-old white man, in 2009. He was brought up on manslaughter charges, and he was found not guilty because of self-defense. So I take issue with the idea, first of all, that if Trayvon Martin were white, this wouldn't have happened. And secondly, and even more importantly, I mean, you said the president was speaking personally as a black man. He is the president of all Americans. And if the Florida prosecutors didn't see it appropriate to inject race into the prosecution of George Zimmerman on second-degree murder charges, why did the president then do that? Wasn't his action much more divisive rather than a unifying act?
Well, first of all, fair enough. I did not know about the case that you just stated. That's something that really should get more attention so that it shows that it can go both ways. But you just said that it didn't involve, at least I didn't hear you say it involved stand your ground. It was the act of self-defense.
Well, and by the way, wait, hold on, Lanny. The Zimmerman case did not involve stand your ground either. That was
correct. And you mentioned the Michigan case that didn't either. So it's about the act of self-defense, whether you think you're reasonably in danger. And I'm glad to hear that a black man was acquitted, probably for the same reasons as Zimmerman was. It's very hard to prove that you don't feel threatened when the man that you killed isn't there to testify. But I think that there is a fine line between being divisive and interjecting race into the Trayvon Martin jury conviction versus saying race was an issue. And it's an issue from the perception of black people. It may not be an issue from a perception, and you said it very, very well, and I appreciate the way you said it. We can't know, we can't feel the way young blacks feel when they're simply because they're black and young, they're viewed with suspicion. I asked my wife, do you feel threatened? Because I certainly understand the sensation of a black kid in a black neighborhood with a hood on walking towards me, feeling, and I feel a little bit of palpitation that maybe he's coming after me.
Right, just like just like if you remember, Jesse Jackson said the same thing when he had said, "I feel concerned when black people come toward me." I mean, isn't that the context that was missing when the president said that he understands what it's like when people lock their doors when he walks by? He didn't say if it was a white man or a black man in the car locking his doors.
Well, first of all, excellent point. Jesse Jackson is one of the few black people in this country who speaks about the real murder and blood shed on the streets of America, about black children killing black children. In the gang atmosphere of lower income people, it's about income and it's about class. It's not about race. But all I'm saying for Barack Obama, going back to your first question, is he tried to walk the line by making a personal statement as our first black president. And I give him that right, and he informed me he's causing this conversation. I don't think he was divisive. His tone wasn't. He wasn't accusatory. And for me, having been critical of him at times, for me, I'm glad he did this.
I just hope that today, after a Friday night rampage in Chicago where 6 people were killed and 23 people were injured in shootings, many of these people black-on-black crimes, I hope today that he also talks about that.
I agree. We need to look. We're having this conversation because Barack Obama was brave enough to be personal, to talk about what it felt like to be a black man, even though he knows there's political risk. He's president of all the people, black and white. But I agree now. We now have to focus on not about race, about class. That goes back to Detroit. We bailed out big banks. We bailed out the wealthy. We gave $800 million of a blank check to the Secretary of the Treasury to write checks to big banks. Why are we not willing to write checks to urban areas that have no revenues, can't even pay their police and fire, much less their pensions? And we need a Marshall Plan for those places, just as we did for Chrysler, just
All right,
as we did for the big
we're opening up a whole another can of worms, as they say.
Let's do that next week.
All right, Lanny, thanks a lot.
Great conversation today. Thank you both.
Thank you.